Tonight, we're heading into the shadowy corners of the Wild West, not to chase outlaws, but to uncover the stranger side of justice. This is where punishment moved faster than reason, and the truth was often buried deeper than the bodies. These aren't your usual cowboy tales. These are the odd ones, the ones whispered about long after sunset. Peculiar punishments, murders wrapped in mystery, a justice system more built on fear than fairness. This isn't about heroes or villains. It's about everything in between, where lawmen turned into ghosts, and some criminals never really left. If you like drifting through the stranger side of history, consider liking and subscribing. And in the comments, tell me, what time is it where you are? And what helps you feel safe when the night grows quiet? Now, pull up the blanket. Let the noise of the day slip away. And listen closely. Because justice in the Wild West wore a crooked smile. And sometimes it sang. Let's begin. The murder that came in a suitcase. There are murders that shake a town, and then there are murders that confuse it. The kind that feel more like a riddle than a crime. The kind where the air doesn't just feel heavy, it feels wrong. This story begins with a suitcase, left beside the train tracks outside a dusty depot in southern Arizona, around 1896. The kind of suitcase that looked too nice to be forgotten, too carefully placed to be lost. The station master noticed it early, just after sunrise. He waited, thinking someone might return, but no one did. Eventually, curiosity gave way to suspicion. A deputy was called. They lifted the leather lid, and inside was a body, folded, broken, like a puppet with its strings cut. The man inside was dressed well. Suit and tie, boots polished, gold pocket watch still ticking. But his neck was snapped, and his face, strangely, bore no sign of panic. Just stillness, as if he'd known it was coming. No one knew who he was. There were no missing persons matching his description, no train tickets, no letters in his pocket, just a handful of silver dollars and a Bible with the name C. Whitaker scrawled inside. But that name meant nothing in that town. And so, the sheriff did what sheriffs often did back then. He buried the man without answers and waited. A week later, a woman arrived, veil over her face, gloves stitched from dark lace. She asked no questions. She only asked for the suitcase. The deputy said it had been burned. That wasn't entirely true. It had been kept, just in case. But he watched the woman's reaction carefully. She didn't flinch. She only said, "Then I've made a mistake," and turned to leave. She was never seen again. Some say it was a private revenge, a man who'd wronged someone far from that town. Some say it was a punishment, a betrayal answered with silence and leather. Some say the woman had killed him herself. Others believe the man was already dead when she found him, that the suitcase was meant as a gift, not a warning. We'll never know. But for years afterward, locals said they saw her, near the tracks, always at dawn, standing still with a dark veil blowing in the desert wind. They called her the mourner. Some swore she whispered. Some said they heard the branding justice when guilt was burned into skin. It was one thing to be punished, quite another to be marked. In the Wild West, where laws traveled slower than bullets, and most justice was handled in rooms that smelled like sweat and tobacco. Branding was a punishment that lived beneath the skin. Literally, you didn't just serve your time, you carried it in fire, in flesh, in letters pressed into your body that told the world exactly what you had done, or what they said you'd done. It wasn't always murder or theft that earned you the brand. Sometimes it was adultery, sometimes it was insolence, and sometimes it was just bad luck. Being the wrong person in the wrong saloon when tempers flared and men needed a scapegoat. The sheriff would hold up a hand and someone would bring the iron, heated in the fire until it glowed like hell's own lantern. And then the letter, T for thief, W for whore, M for murderer, or just plain X, the mark of someone who belonged nowhere anymore. They called it justice. Swift, satisfying, public. They said it taught a lesson. But what it really did was brand shame. Not just into the skin, but into the soul. Once you were marked, you were watched, followed, feared. People crossed the street when they saw your scar. No one asked your side. No one asked if the story was true. The brand was the story now. In one town, a young woman named Eliza was marked with an H for harlot because the preacher's son had been found in her room. Never mind that he had climbed through the window. Never mind that she said no. The town needed someone to blame, and Eliza was unmarried, poor, and already too pretty for their comfort. The sentence was passed with no trial. She was taken to the edge of town, held down, and branded on the shoulder, the iron hissing as it kissed her skin. She didn't scream, not once. And afterward, she stayed, refused to leave, wore dresses that showed her scar, walked with her chin lifted. People said she'd gone mad. But the truth was simpler. She decided that if the world would burn her for something she hadn't done, she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of hiding. Eliza became a legend. Some say she ran a boarding house. Others say she joined a group of traveling women who took in the broken, the branded, the cast out, the silent. Her H became a kind of badge, a rebellion, a warning to anyone who thought they could silence her with heat and iron. And there were others, men branded for stealing horses when they'd only borrowed them. A boy marked for arson when all he'd done was light a fire to keep warm. A woman branded for killing her husband. A husband who'd broken her ribs and her jaw long before she reached for the knife. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd be afraid of the pain, but because you'd see the injustice in the room and refuse to look away. You'd ask who heated the iron, who stood still and watched, who decided one letter was enough to erase a whole life. Still, some people resisted. There were healers who made salves from ash and honey, old women who taught the branded how to fade their marks in moonlight, lovers who kissed the scar as if it were scripture. Some carved new tattoos over the letters, flowers, stars, feathers, reclaiming the skin, rewriting the story. And sometimes the brand didn't shame, it sparked. A man named Will, branded with a T, became a preacher for the damned. Not in a church, but in taverns, in alleyways, in the dirt behind jails. He spoke of second chances, of fire that purified, not punished. He wore his T like a cross. And the people who listened, they weren't saints, but they understood. Dancing on the gallows, when hangings became a show. Not every punishment in the Wild West happened behind closed doors. In fact, the more public the spectacle, the more satisfying it seemed to be, for the crowd at least. Because there were times when a rope and a platform were all the law needed, and justice came with a wooden stage, a creaking trap door, and a crowd of onlookers holding lemonade and boiled peanuts like they were waiting for a parade. Hangings didn't start with solemnity. They started with excitement. Word would spread like prairie fire. There's gonna be a hanging. By dawn, folks would come from miles around, wagons bouncing along dusty trails, children in their Sunday best, mothers with picnic baskets, men with flasks hidden in their coat pockets. It was a social event, a holiday without the cheer. And the one thing no one seemed to question was whether the person at the center of it all actually deserved what was coming. Some were guilty, some weren't. Some never got a trial. Some got one in name only, a half hour in a too-hot room, a jury of angry neighbors, a judge more interested in making a point than finding the truth. But once the gallows were built, it was too late to turn back. The lumber had been hammered, the noose had been tied, the crowd had arrived, and the show would go on. One hanging, perhaps the strangest on record, took place in 1881 in a town called Dry Hollow. The man's name was Dillard Horn, a cattle rustler turned preacher turned thief again. No one really knew which version of him was true. He was caught with 2 stolen horses and a bag of letters that didn't belong to him. That might have earned him a jail sentence if he hadn't insulted the mayor's daughter during his arrest. That sealed his fate. The town square was prepared. The gallows went up in a single night, splinters and all. On the morning of the execution, Dillard arrived in a black suit with a red silk cravat. His last request. He smiled as he walked up the steps, whistled a hymn, asked the hangman if the knot was tied right. The crowd laughed, nervously, because something about Dillard's calm made them uneasy. Then he spoke. They let him as a formality, but no one expected him to say what he did. He looked out over the crowd, the shopkeepers, the children, the ones who had once called him friend, and he said, "When you watch a man die, don't blink, don't look away, because the moment you do, you lose the piece of yourself that could have stopped it." And then he danced. Not in mockery, not in defiance, but in rhythm, slow deliberate steps on the platform, like he was already halfway to the next world and just needed to move through the music to get there. The hangman hesitated. The crowd went quiet. For just a moment, it wasn't justice. It was theater. It was ritual. It was something else. And when the lever was pulled, Dillard dropped without a sound. They buried him just outside the town limits, as was custom. No stone, just a tree, and still, to this day, some say if you pass through Dry Hollow and stand near that spot at sunset, you can hear the faint scrape of shoes on old wood, like someone still dancing. You wouldn't last a day, not because of the violence, but because of the celebration of it. You'd want to stop the cheers. Ask who decided death was something to watch. Who made it a party? And the answer, quiet and cruel, would be, we all did. Still, some people turned away. Some mothers shielded their children's eyes. Some men drank more than usual that night, not to toast, but to forget. Some children grew up remembering the way the rope creaked and never quite smiled the same way again. And a few, just a few, started writing things down. Questions, names, doubts, the beginnings of change, coffins for the living, the bizarre punishment of premature burial. Some punishments were made not to kill, but to terrify, to leave a mark so deep it followed a person for the rest of their life, even if their body walked away intact. And in a few scattered corners of the Wild West, where fear sometimes replaced reason, and law was a matter of performance, there were stories whispered, half believed, half forgotten, about a punishment almost too strange to be true: the coffin for the living. It wasn't common. Even back then, even in towns where hangings and brandings were routine, this was considered extreme. But in places where the sheriffs were more showman than lawman, where spectacle mattered more than fairness, it happened. Quietly. Once or twice, maybe more. And it was always meant to send a message. You might survive this, but you'll never forget it. A man named Tobias Crane was the first name whispered in connection with it. A gambler, a liar, a thief. He'd been run out of 2 counties already. In the third, he stole from the wrong man, the local banker's wife. Not money. Jewelry. A pearl brooch passed down through 3 generations. A thing not easily replaced and deeply personal. When they found Tobias, the town wanted blood, but the sheriff, he wanted memory. The men built the box in a single night. Pine wood, nails, heavy iron handles. They placed it in the middle of town the next morning. Not underground, but above, in the square, where everyone could see. Tobias, bound and gagged, was placed inside. They didn't seal the lid completely, just enough to let in air, and just enough to trap sound. You could hear the screaming, muffled, ragged, a wild, echoing panic that made dogs bark and children cry. He stayed in that box for a full day and a full night. People walked past. Some watched. Some tried not to. A few threw rocks. Others left water near the edge, though no one could say why. And when they finally opened the box, Tobias was different. Pale, shaking. The sound of his own heartbeat lodged in his ears like thunder. He didn't speak for 3 days. And when he did, it was with a voice so cracked and hoarse it sounded like wind dragging across old bones. He left town that same week. But the coffin stayed. It became a relic. A warning. A place children dared each other to touch after dark. And though it rotted and splintered over time, no one ever burned it. It simply stayed there until the desert swallowed it back into silence. You wouldn't last a day, not because of the dark, but because of the cruelty. You'd want to rip the lid off. Let the man breathe. Say that punishment should not feel like burial. You'd ask, what does fear teach us, except to hide? Still, the story didn't end with Tobias. Years later, in a town miles away, a woman named Clara Wilkes was accused of poisoning her husband. The evidence was thin. A fever, a rumor, a teacup left unwashed. But the townspeople remembered Tobias, remembered the coffin, and someone quietly suggested it again. This time, the coffin was placed in a church basement. No crowd, no noise. Just Clara, left in the dark, with nothing but her breath and the creaking sound of wood settling. She lasted 12 hours. When they pulled her out, she wept. Not from guilt, but from violation. She hadn't done it. Her husband died of a burst appendix, but her punishment remained. She never returned to the church, never looked at her neighbors again. She moved away, changed her name. And every year, on the day they buried her alive, she stayed in bed with the windows closed. Because sometimes the body survives, but the soul remembers the coffin, the town that put a corpse on trial. It sounds like a joke, like a dark bit of folklore told at the end of a long night around a campfire. But somewhere in the folding stretch of the West, where superstition and desperation often held hands, there was once a town that held a real legal trial for a man who was already dead. They propped his body up in the courthouse. And yes, it really happened. No one remembers exactly what the town was called. Some said it was just east of El Paso. Others claimed it was somewhere in northern New Mexico. What is remembered, passed down like a fever dream, was that the man's name was Eli Torkel. A rancher, reclusive, strange, accused many times of theft, of poisoning wells, of making threats, but never proven, always slippery, always just out of reach, until he turned up dead. No one knew who killed him. The sheriff claimed he found Eli's body near the creek, a bullet clean through the chest, blood already black. No witnesses, no confession. But when they searched his shack, they found strange things. Dried herbs, dead birds, bones, a doll stuck with pins. And suddenly, the town was sure Eli hadn't just been a criminal. He was a witch. Now, out in the Wild West, witchcraft wasn't supposed to exist. That was Salem's problem. But fear doesn't care about geography. And when cattle went missing, and children fell sick, and the skies refused to rain, people remembered the way Eli looked at them. Too long, too knowing, too quiet. So the mayor, under pressure, announced a trial. The dead man, his body cleaned and dressed and beginning to rot in the dry heat, was placed upright in a chair. Witnesses were called. Accusations were made. The crowd was silent at first, then louder, angry, alive with something old and ugly. The preacher swore Eli cursed his crops. The blacksmith's wife said he killed her dog with a single glance. And when it came time for the defense, there was none. They found him guilty of murder, of theft, of witchcraft, of everything the town had feared but never proven. His sentence? To be hanged, again, publicly, his lifeless body hoisted onto the gallows, the rope tied as if death could happen twice. They did it at dawn, quietly, ashamed maybe, but determined. No one spoke afterward, no one wrote it down. But the gallows stayed up far longer than usual, and the noose, they said, swayed in windless air for days. You wouldn't last a day, not because of the madness of it, but because you'd scream for reason. You'd say, he's dead. You'd say, you're grieving the wrong way. You'd say fear is in a courtroom, but out there, in a place where logic had long since dried up. No one would hear you. Still, some people remembered the shame. Years later, a school was built on the edge of that town, near the creek where Eli's shack had been. Teachers told stories in quiet tones. Students dared each other to visit the spot. One woman, a teacher with a silver cross around her neck, planted flowers there each spring. Yellow ones, no plaque, no explanation. Just something living where something wrong had happened. Because even when justice fails, memory doesn't. The man who was hanged twice. In the Wild West, death didn't always stick the first time. That's not folklore. That's history, as strange and unsettling as a desert wind whispering your name. There are stories buried in courthouse ledgers and old newspaper clippings of a man who stood on the gallows, took the drop, swung, and lived, and of a town that didn't know what to do with him after that. His name was Tom Whistler Bell, a stagecoach robber, according to some, a horse thief, according to others. What most people agreed on was that he was clever, charming, and far too lucky for his own good. He escaped custody twice, talked his way out of another hanging once, and was finally caught near the Sierra foothills with $6 in his boot and a letter addressed to a woman named Clara that no one ever found. They built the gallows quickly, like they always did. The town square filled with people, curious ones, hungry for justice, they said, or maybe just hungry for something to distract them from the ache of their own lives. Tom climbed the steps like a man going to church. Calm, no fight. He even thanked the hangman, said the rope looked well made. Then he said his last words, which were, "Guess I'll find out if I really got 9 lives." They dropped him. And then the strangest thing happened. He didn't die. The rope snapped. It didn't fray. It didn't stretch. It snapped, clean through like a dry twig. Tom hit the ground with a crack of bone and breath, stunned but breathing. The crowd gasped. Someone screamed. And for a moment, no one knew what to do. Some people said it was a sign that God had intervened, that Tom should be spared. A few rushed forward, trying to help him sit up, but the sheriff, face white with something between fear and fury, stepped forward and ordered a new rope. They strung him up again. This time, they doubled the cord, tied the knot tighter, made sure everything was right. And Tom, dazed, bruised, maybe with a broken rib, still managed to say, "Tell Clara, I went smiling." He did not survive the second drop. They buried him quietly, away from the town limits. No marker, no mourners, just a grave, and the memory of a morning when justice hesitated, just long enough to make people wonder if they'd done the right thing. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd stop the hanging, but because you'd ask the question no one wanted to answer. What if a man surviving the rope means something? What if that's the only verdict we need? But out there, mercy made men nervous. Still, some remembered. One of the undertaker's daughters, years later, wrote a poem about a man who danced with death and didn't flinch, about a town that saw a second chance and turned it down. It was never published, but it lived, copied by hand, folded into journals, passed from daughter to daughter like a quiet torch. And some say, when the wind howls just right in that canyon, you can hear whistling. A low, wandering tune, like someone walking home, alone, but not afraid. The man in the cage who lived on display. Justice in the Wild West had little interest in dignity. Sometimes it came with a bullet, fast and final. Other times it came slow, dressed in humiliation, stretched across weeks or months like a punishment that couldn't make up its mind whether it wanted to kill the body or simply break the soul. And nowhere was that clearer than in the strange, cruel fate of the man in the cage. A punishment so public, so prolonged, it became less about crime and more about entertainment. His name was Lyle Garvey. They called him Snake Eyes, not because he played cards, but because folks, as he said, his stare could curdle milk. He had a reputation, sure. Rough with his words, mean when he drank. Accused more than once of stealing cattle. Accused, too, of killing a man over a bottle of whiskey in a saloon brawl that left more than one table broken and more than one story behind. But it was never proven. The sheriff, tired of Lyle's name showing up in every report, finally decided to make an example. Not with rope, not with prison. They didn't want to waste a cell. Instead, they built a cage. Iron bars, 6 feet long, 4 feet high, hung from wooden beams outside the courthouse like a cruel bird cage, and they put him inside, day and night. He couldn't stand, could barely sit. The sun beat down in the afternoon. The chill crept in at night. Rain pooled around his feet. Dust coated his lips. The townspeople came to see. Not to help, to watch. Children pointed. Grown men spit at his boots. Women crossed themselves as if he were already dead. Or worse, cursed. They brought him food once a day. Water when they remembered. Sometimes boys threw rocks just to hear him grunt. And yet, he didn't scream. Not once. He stared out, eyes calm, jaw tight, the very stillness of him unsettling. He stayed there for 30 days. And when they let him out, bone thin and half mad from silence and sun, he didn't speak. Just walked, out of town, into the hills, never came back. But the cage stayed, for years, rusting, empty, a warning and a memory. Until one morning, it was gone. No one knew who took it. Some said Lyle returned. Some said the sheriff, grown old and gray, couldn't stand the sight of it anymore. Others claimed it simply collapsed under the weight of what it had meant. You wouldn't last a day, not because you couldn't endure the cage, but because you'd see what others refused to. That punishment, without mercy, becomes performance. That cruelty dressed as justice poisons everyone who watches it. Still, some saw the truth. A girl, no older than 10, left a cup of water outside the cage each morning. No one noticed. Not at first, but Lyle drank from it. Every time. And when he left, the girl kept placing it there, even after he was gone, for weeks, as if to say, you were seen, and sometimes that's all someone needs. The sheriff who vanished after the verdict. There are stories in the Wild West that never found an ending. Stories that leave behind questions, not conclusions. Whispers, not justice. One such story followed a sheriff who disappeared the night after he sentenced a man to hang. A man, some say, wasn't guilty, and others say never existed at all. It was a small town, the kind with only one road and too many secrets. The sheriff's name was Declan Rudd, a quiet man, steady hands, known for reading more than he spoke, and for keeping a clean office with a single photograph on his desk. A woman no one had ever seen in town. Some said she was dead. Others said she'd left. Declan never said. The crime was brutal. A farmer's wife found dead in her barn. Rope marks on her wrists, straw soaked in blood, and the whole town, hungry for justice, waited for someone, anyone, to pay for it. The suspect came quickly, a drifter. No name, no kin, just a scar along his jaw, and a quiet way of walking that made people uncomfortable. He'd been seen in town 2 nights before, asking for work, eating bread from his coat pocket, sleeping in the hayloft of an abandoned stable. And that was enough. They arrested him at dawn, brought him to Declan, and by sundown, a makeshift trial had passed a sentence. Guilty. Hang by the neck until dead. But something in Declan shifted. That night, with the wind shaking the shutters and the stars sharp in the sky, he sat alone at his desk. The drifter was locked in the cell across the room, and though the sheriff never said a word, his eyes never left that man's face. Not once. As if he were searching it for something more than guilt. As if he were trying to remember. In the morning, both were gone. The cell was open. The sheriff's gun belt still hung on the wall. The keys were in the lock. But there was no sign of the drifter. No sign of Declan. Only the photograph on the desk, turned face down, and a single piece of paper beneath it. It said, "There are worse things than doubt." The town searched for days, weeks, sent riders into the hills, asked other towns, but neither man was ever seen again. Some said the sheriff let the drifter go and fled with him. Others believed the sheriff had gone mad, that he'd imagined the whole thing, that there was no drifter, just an empty cell and a crime too ugly to solve. Years passed. The jail fell into ruin. Children dared each other to enter, to sit in the old cell, to find the paper that no longer existed. And yet, sometimes, late at night, when the wind passed through the broken windows, people swore they heard boots across the floorboards and a quiet voice saying, "I'm not sure anymore." You wouldn't last a day, not because of the danger, but because you'd refuse to convict without knowing. You'd need the truth. You'd wait for it. And in a world that needed answers more than it needed justice, that would make you dangerous. Still, some people kept asking. A teacher collected court records long after the town stopped caring. A preacher lit a candle every year on the night Declan vanished. A widow told her grandchildren, "Not every truth has a witness, but that doesn't mean it isn't real." And sometimes, that's enough. The widow who collected teeth. Not all punishments in the Wild West came from lawmen or judges. Some came from grief. Some from a pain so sharp it couldn't be buried with the body. And sometimes, those punishments came in strange forms. Quiet, symbolic, unsettling. This is the story of a widow who never raised her voice, never broke a law, and never let a killer go free. Her name was Abigail Greeley. She lived on the edge of a town that barely made it onto maps. A school teacher once, before her husband, a ranch hand named Thomas, was shot in the chest on his way home from the saloon. They said it was a robbery. They said they'd never find the man who did it. They said it's just the way things go out here. But Abigail didn't agree. She didn't weep at the funeral. She didn't shout. She didn't ask the sheriff why no one had been arrested. She just buried her husband beneath the cottonwood tree behind their house, wrapped his wedding shirt around a small bundle of herbs, and began to wait. The first man died 3 months later. Heart failure, they said. Found alone in his cabin, mouth open, teeth missing. The second, 4 months after that, fell from his horse, crushed his skull, teeth missing. The third, and this is when people started whispering, drowned in the well. They never figured out how, but when they pulled him out, his mouth was gaping and empty. 9 men died over 6 years, quiet deaths. No violence that could be proven. No patterns except this. Each had been drinking with Thomas Greeley the night he died. Each had said he was asking for it. Each had walked home that night while Thomas bled into the dirt alone. And each, when found, had no teeth. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd be frightened of her, but because you'd understand her too well. You'd recognize the look in her eyes, the calm, the waiting, the knowing. And you'd wonder, if it had been your love, buried under the tree, what might you have done? Still, she never admitted a thing. Abigail kept to herself, grew vegetables, sewed clothes, read books by lamplight. Children said she whispered to the cottonwood tree at night, her back straight, her voice too low to carry. Some said her garden bloomed strangely well. Some said she buried more than seeds. When she died, in her sleep, peacefully, at the age of 71, they found a box beneath the floorboards. A wooden chest lined with black velvet. Inside, 37 human teeth, clean, labeled, ordered by date. The sheriff burned the box without ceremony, said it was best not to talk about such things. But the town remembered, quietly, carefully, and no one ever tried to call her mad, or wicked, or wrong, because sometimes justice doesn't wear a badge. Sometimes it wears a black dress and a quiet smile, and sometimes it waits, with time and memory and patience sharper than any blade. The horse thief. They buried standing up. Justice was supposed to end with a grave, a stone, a name carved into wood or rock. But in the Wild West, where legend often outran truth and revenge wore its Sunday best, some punishments didn't stop at death. They reached beyond it. They made a spectacle of the stillness. And one of the strangest examples, a man they buried on his feet, upright, with his eyes pointed east, as if death itself wasn't enough to humble him. His name was Elias Black, tall, smiling, hands that never stopped moving, dice, cards, reins. He stole horses like other men breathed, quick, quiet, with a laugh that never quite touched his eyes. He wasn't cruel, just fast, always moving on, until he stole from the wrong man. Judge Whitlow was a cattle baron with more land than sense, and a temper that came quicker than rain. When Elias took one of his prized black mares in the middle of the night, he didn't wait for a trial. He sent men, tracked him across 3 counties, caught him sleeping near a dry creek bed, shirt off, boots still warm from the run. The town didn't even pretend to ask questions. They built the gallows by supper. The hanging came at dusk, and Elias, they say, winked at the crowd as the noose was placed. His final words? "Tell the mayor I'm sorry." But that wasn't the end. Judge Whitlow wasn't satisfied. He said hanging wasn't enough for a man who disrespected a bloodline horse. He said Elias needed to serve as a warning, even in the dirt. So they dug the hole narrow and deep, and they buried Elias standing up, boots on, hat in place, ropes tied to hold his spine straight. No coffin, just dirt packed around him like cement, and facing east, so that every morning the sun would rise and hit the face of a man who once thought he could outrun consequence. They marked the grave with nothing but a horseshoe. You wouldn't last a day, not because of the punishment, but because of the pettiness. Because you'd see what others missed. That cruelty disguised as pride is still cruelty. That a man already dead needs no more humbling. That honor, once warped by ego, turns to rot faster than any corpse. Still, the town whispered. Children dared each other to visit the spot. Some claimed you could hear creaking when the wind blew, as if the ropes inside the earth were shifting. One woman left flowers every year, not because she loved him, but because no one deserves to stand for eternity. Years later, a flood came through the valley, washed away part of the hillside where Elias was buried. A boy found a boot. Upright, mud-caked, still laced. The sheriff told him to throw it back in the river, but the boy kept it. Said it reminded him that the ground doesn't always stay still, that even the earth doesn't always agree with how men measure justice, the town that paid for blood. Justice was often for sale in the Wild West, not with gold, but with silence. With looks passed between men in dusty rooms, with coins slid across bars and names erased from ledgers. But in one town, nestled between 2 ridgelines where the sky always seemed just a little too close, the law was more direct. When someone died, wrongfully, violently, unfairly, they didn't just bury the dead. They paid the family in coins, in cattle, in weight. They called it blood money, not metaphor, literal. For every murder, the town held a vote. If the death was deemed unjust, if the crowd decided the killing had come without warning, without reason, without a duel or a chance to flee, then the guilty party owed the family restitution. Not through the courts, not in jail time, but in payment. Ounces of silver, barrels of grain, a goat, a rifle, sometimes even a child indentured for labor. It was called the ledger, a book kept in the sheriff's safe, bound in red leather. Names and dates written in the same hand for 30 years. No verdicts, no trials, just transactions. And the townspeople abided by it because, they said, it kept the peace. Because, they said, it made life cheaper and death more honest. But what it really did was turn grief into a price tag. In 1879, a man named Bo Eller shot his neighbor in a dispute over a fence line. The neighbor died where he stood, hands open. Bo never ran. Said he didn't mean it. Said he just lost his temper. The vote passed 22-3. Unjust. The debt was set at $80 and 2 horses. Bo paid it. The man's widow took the money, but she never smiled again. And in 1883, when a teenage girl was found drowned in the irrigation ditch, suspicion turned toward the ranch foreman, the only one seen speaking with her that day. No one could prove a thing. But the vote passed again, and the foreman, pale and trembling, handed over 4 saddles, a milk cow, and his mother's wedding ring. They said it was justice, balanced, fair, but the ledger kept growing, and the pages grew heavier. You wouldn't last a day, not because you couldn't accept restitution, but because you'd want more. You'd ask, what is a life really worth? You'd say, a coin cannot quiet grief. And the town, which had grown used to tidy endings, would flinch at your words. Still, some people resisted the trade. One woman, Elvira Denton, lost her husband in a bar fight. When offered her blood price, $60 and a mule, she spat in the sheriff's ledger, said, I want the truth, not the payment. She left the town the next day, walking east with nothing but her grief and her husband's coat. And when she died, years later, her children found a note tucked in the lining. Don't measure people in coin. We're worth more than that. And some say, long after the ledger stopped being used, that the book was found in the sheriff's attic, its pages warped with age. The ink faded, but one final entry was still clear. Name, all of us. Crime, forgetting what justice means. Price, too much. Sleep now. No one is measuring your worth. No coins are being counted. No vote is being held behind closed doors. You owe nothing. You are not in debt. You are not a transaction. Let your name rest gently in the dark. Let your life be unpriced. Let your story be priceless. No ledger can hold you. No weight is owed. Only peace, only breath, only sleep. You are not a price to be paid. You are a soul to be held. And tonight, you are held. Gently, freely, without cost. The man who chose his own execution. Some punishments in the Wild West were brutal. Some were bizarre. But a few were handed down with something even stranger, a choice. That's what happened in a wind-swept outpost town so small it barely had a name. A place where the saloon had more pews than the church. And justice depended less on laws and more on who you were to the right people. His name was Isaac Braddock, once a lawman himself, once respected, once seen cleaning blood off his badge in the quiet hours after a shootout, and still showing up for Sunday supper like nothing happened. But something changed. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was drink. Maybe it was the grief no one ever saw. The kind that settles into your bones like dust and doesn't leave, no matter how many times you shake it loose. He shot a man in the middle of town. Broad daylight. The man, some said, had cheated him in poker. Others said he'd insulted Isaac's wife, a woman already in the ground 2 winters past. No one knew the real reason, but the shot was clean, right between the eyes. And Isaac didn't run, just handed over his gun, tipped his hat, and waited. The town gathered. There was no trial, not really. They all knew him, had grown up with him. He'd arrested their fathers, their cousins. He'd saved the mayor's son from drowning once. And so, out of respect, or perhaps out of guilt, they gave him something no one else had ever been offered. A choice. "We won't hang you," the mayor said, hands trembling behind his back, "but you can choose how you go." Isaac nodded, didn't speak, just left the room and came back an hour later with a bottle of whiskey and a single bullet in his hand. He chose the desert. They gave him a horse, a day's worth of water, and that one bullet. No one followed. No one needed to. Everyone knew what the bullet was for. When the thirst got too sharp, when the heat climbed too high, when the wolves came close, that bullet was his mercy, his choice. Some say he made it 5 miles, some say 10. A traveler passing through claimed to see a man sitting cross-legged in the sand, sipping from his canteen, staring at the sky like it held the answers he'd waited for his whole life. No one knows for sure. But they found the horse 3 days later, tied to a branch, saddle empty. They never found Isaac. No body, no gun, no boot prints, just silence. As if the desert had swallowed him whole, honoring the kind of man who'd once dealt punishment and now answered to it, on his own terms. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd choose wrong, but because you'd refuse to choose at all. You'd ask, why must punishment always end in death? Why does a single mistake erase an entire life? And in a place where mercy made men uncomfortable, that would be too much to bear. Still, some remembered him kindly. A child, grown old, recalled the way Isaac once carried her across a flooded stream. A widow left a stone on the edge of town where the road disappeared into the sand, marked only with the word honor. And on windy nights, when the moon rose full and pale over the dry hills, a faint whistle could sometimes be heard, low, steady, like a tune someone hummed to themselves while waiting for sleep to come. The stranger who was shot before he spoke. Some punishments didn't come from the law. They came from fear, from crowds with twitching fingers and itchy triggers, from the kind of silence that happens just before a shot is fired, the kind that carries more weight than a verdict ever could. And sometimes it didn't matter if you'd done anything at all. Sometimes just not being known was enough. That's what happened to the stranger. He arrived at dusk. A tall man, thin, pale from travel, coat dusty, hat pulled low. He didn't ride in on a storm or shout into the saloon or spit on the boardwalk like the villains in the stories. He just walked, slow, even steps, toward the general store with a saddlebag slung over one shoulder. No one knew his name. And that, in the Wild West, was sometimes all it took. The town was tense that year, cattle missing, a barn burned. The mayor's daughter had run off with a drifter and hadn't written back. Nerves were high. Suspicion clung to everyone's breath. So when the stranger walked in and asked for tobacco and a tin of peaches, the clerk narrowed his eyes, watched his hands, watched his silence. By the time the stranger stepped back outside, 3 men were already waiting. "Where you headed?" one asked. "Through," the stranger replied, voice quiet. Not scared, not smug, just tired. And maybe that's what did it. Maybe it was the calm, the stillness, the refusal to offer a name. Maybe it was the shape of the saddlebag or the scar on his left cheek. Maybe it was nothing at all. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even take a step forward. And still, the shot rang out. One bullet, center chest. The stranger dropped without a word. The man who fired it, a rancher named Doyle, swore later that he thought the stranger was reaching. Swore he looked like someone on a wanted poster. Swore he just acted too calm. But no poster was ever found. And the sheriff, who hadn't spoken to the stranger at all, simply wrote, "Unknown male, buried east of town," in the ledger and left the rest blank. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd pull the trigger, but because you'd ask why no one stopped it. You'd ask, when did fear become a reason to kill? And the silence that followed would be the answer. Still, someone remembered him. The young boy who had brought in the mail that day later admitted the stranger had given him a coin. Just one, polished silver. Told him to spend it on something sweet. The boy kept it, carried it in his pocket until he was old, until he had children of his own. And when he finally told them the story, he ended it with one quiet truth. He never even got to explain who he was. And that coin? He passed it to his daughter. She wore it on a chain around her neck. For luck, she said. For remembering the corpse that kept getting dug up. In most towns, once a person was buried, that was supposed to be the end of it. Earth to earth, dust to dust. A wooden cross, maybe, or a pile of stones. A place for quiet, not questions. But in one crooked little town, with more secrets than buildings, there was a grave that refused to stay closed, and a corpse that kept being pulled back into the light. His name was Jasper Dunn. He'd been a barber, a gambler, a man known for having more stories than haircuts, and a knack for vanishing right before debts came due. He died suddenly, heart failure, they said, slumped over a card table with a handful of spades and a smile that made people uneasy. They buried him the next morning, quick, quiet, no family to speak for him, just the preacher, the barkeep, and 2 gravediggers with hangovers. But the very next day, someone dug him up. The grave was shallow. The coffin lid had been cracked. And when the sheriff found it, Jasper's body was there, untouched, pale, still smiling, as if he'd been waiting. They buried him again, this time deeper, with stones packed around the lid. 2 nights later, same thing. This time, the coffin was open. The body missing. They found him propped up behind the saloon, sitting against the wall, like he was waiting for one last round of cards. His eyes were closed, his smile the same. No footprints, no sign of who had moved him, just a deck of cards scattered at his feet, and one candle burned low. They buried him a 3rd time, this time with chains over the coffin. A padlock. But the grave was found empty a week later. By then, the town had stopped asking questions. They started whispering that Jasper had owed more than money, that maybe he hadn't died of natural causes, that maybe someone had wanted him to keep paying, even in death. Or maybe Jasper, being Jasper, just couldn't bear the thought of staying quiet forever. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd fear the grave, but because you'd want to know. You'd follow the trail, ask the wrong questions. You'd say, "Let the dead rest," and someone might answer, "Only if they're finished." Still, some tried to help. The widow of a man Jasper had once saved during a house fire came to town. She brought a quilt, laid it over his body when they buried him the fourth time. She read a prayer, lit a lantern, slept beside the grave one night, and when she left the next morning, the ground had not been disturbed. And after that, the digging stopped. Maybe it was the prayer, maybe it was the quilt, or maybe Jasper finally felt seen. The grave is still there, unmarked, overgrown. But if you sit beside it, they say, you'll feel a kind of warmth, not ghostly, not cold, just present. As if someone nearby is playing with a deck of cards and smiling at your confusion. The woman who sentenced men with a bell. Out in the cracked hills past the mining camps and broken homesteads, there lived a woman the townsfolk called the Bell Widow. Her real name was Annabeth Rook. No husband, no children. Just a cabin built into the side of a mausoleum, and a voice that carried clear across the dry wind. No one knew where she came from. One day she wasn't there. The next, she was, with her long black dress and her tower of silence. That's what they called it, the tower. It wasn't much, just a crooked wooden scaffold with a single bell hanging from its top beam, rusted and heavy. No rope, no clapper, just the bell, still and waiting. And every time a man went missing in that valley, a ranch hand, a drifter, a man who bragged too much in the saloon, the bell would ring the next morning, just once, low and deep, like the end of a prayer. No one ever saw her touch it, but the sound always came. The first time, they thought it was the wind, but when they climbed the hill to look, they found the bell untouched. No footprints. And yet, the town's blacksmith had vanished. A man known for quick tempers and heavy fists. 2 nights earlier, someone had heard a woman screaming, but no one had answered. Then it happened again. A gambler, slick with sweat and lies, had taken everything from a girl working at the inn. Her savings, her shoes, her dignity. No one did anything. The next morning, the bell rang, and the man was gone. They found his boots by the river. Nothing else. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd fear the bell, but because you'd ask why it was needed in the first place. You'd say, why did she have to be the one to carry justice when no one else would? And the wind, curling through the hills, would answer you softly, because no one else did. Still, the town never touched her. They whispered. Oh, they whispered. Said she was a witch. Said she made deals with shadows. Said she spoke to the ground. But no one climbed that hill with a gun. No one knocked on her door, because deep down, they knew. Every man the bell had claimed had earned it. And for those who hadn't, well, the bell never rang for them. Over the years, people learned. Women began walking taller. Men looked each other in the eye before raising their voice. And the bell? It rang less and less, until one day it stopped entirely. When she died, old, quiet, alone. They buried her beneath the bell, not because they had to, because they wanted to. And they hung a small plaque that read, "For the ones no one else heard, the man they fed to the vultures." Sometimes justice didn't come with a trial, or a jail cell, or even a noose. Sometimes it came with silence. Hot, heavy, sun-sick silence, and the sound of wings circling overhead. In the far reaches of the desert, where the ground cracked like old skin, and even the cacti leaned toward shade, there was a kind of punishment that didn't require lawmen or judges. Just a long walk, a blindfold, and the promise that the buzzards would do the rest. The man's name was Everett Pike, a rustler, a killer maybe. The stories changed depending on who you asked. Some said he shot a family in their sleep for a sack of flour. Some said he poisoned a water barrel during a feud between ranches. Others said he was just unlucky, that he was nearby when someone else's revenge needed a face. Whatever the truth, when they caught him, the town didn't argue about what to do. They just marched him out. No rope, no firing squad, no announcement. They rode half a day from town, carrying nothing but canteens, rifles, and a single blindfold. When they reached the mesa, they made him walk the last few steps barefoot. The sand was blister hot, the air so dry it hurt to breathe. And when he asked if anyone wanted to hear his side, no one answered. They tied his hands behind his back, set him down on a rock, and left him there. No grave, no marker, just open sky, and the vultures already circling. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd fear the birds, but because you'd stay. You'd sit with the man, ask what happened, listen. You'd want to understand before the bones were picked clean. And the men who left him there, they'd call that weakness. But the desert remembers. They say he lasted longer than anyone thought. That for 2 days he sat there, shoulders blistered, lips cracked, eyes closed beneath the blindfold. They say the buzzards didn't land until the 3rd morning. And even then, one of them, an old one, white around the beak, just stood near him for hours, as if watching, as if waiting. When a pair of hunters passed through a week later, they found what was left, a circle of feathers, an empty canteen, and the word mercy carved into the stone beneath where he'd sat. Not scratched, not scrawled. Carved. Slowly. With effort. Like someone had used the last hours of his life not to curse, but to forgive. Still, someone buried the bones. The hunters said nothing, just piled rocks over what remained, marked it with a sun-bleached branch, left a folded scarf beside it. The wind took it, eventually, but for a time, it fluttered like a flag no one wanted to claim. The judge, who wrote his sentences in blood. He came into town with books, not bullets. Tall, soft-spoken, with hair like iron filings and hands that never shook, even when tempers flared. They called him Judge Marin. No one knew where he was from. Some whispered Boston. Others said the army, or even something darker. But he brought with him a desk, a Bible, and a reputation for fairness so sharp it could slice clean through a lie. At first, people were glad. A judge meant order. meant a man who understood the law, not just the noise of guns and grudges. But it didn't take long for them to realize something was wrong. He wrote every sentence in blood, not just metaphor, literal. Each verdict, each punishment, from theft to murder, was written in a ledger bound in cracked leather, with a pen dipped not in ink, but in the blood of the condemned. The cut was small, always taken from the arm or hand. The judge would draw it himself, a quick nick, a silver basin. Then he would write names, dates, crimes, and below a single word, guilty. He never sentenced anyone without evidence, but he never showed mercy either. And the strangest part? No one ever resisted. No one ran. No one shouted when he took their hand. They sat still as he bled them, as if hypnotized, as if the act itself, the quiet ritual, made their fate real. The townsfolk grew uneasy, but they said nothing, because the judge was fair, always fair. He never accused without proof. He listened. He asked questions others wouldn't. And when he sentenced someone, they always deserved it, at least at first. Until he sentenced a child, a boy, just 12, caught stealing bread, hungry, orphaned, barefoot. The shopkeeper had shouted. The boy had run. The judge had called for him the next morning. The courtroom was full. People expecting a warning, a fine, maybe even a lecture. Instead, he bled the boy, took the pen, wrote the sentence. 1 year in labor. And then everyone knew. The judge was not just a man. He was a system, a machine. One that ran not on vengeance or anger, but on cold, perfect procedure. And that somehow was worse. You wouldn't last a day. Not because you'd fear the blood, but because you'd refuse to let it become normal. You'd ask, what are we writing in these books? Are they records or chains? You'd demand a new kind of justice. And the judge, calm as ever, would dip his pen again and say, then you'd better bring your own ink. Still, some resisted. The boy's sister, no older than 16, walked into the courtroom the next day and laid her hand on the judge's desk. Bleed me instead, she said. And for the first time, the judge hesitated. He didn't speak, just stared, then closed the ledger. The boy was never sent to labor. The judge left that night. His desk was found empty, the basin cleaned, the ledger gone. But the town kept the courtroom, and on its back wall, carved into wood by the girl's hand, were 5 words: no sentence without our voice. The boy who carried a skull in his satchel. In some corners of the Wild West, death was just another neighbor, always nearby, always watching, never out of sight for too long. Most people learned to look away, to bury their dead and move on, to speak of the departed with silence, not story. But one boy, he carried death with him, not in his mind, not in his dreams, but in a small canvas satchel, tied with twine and worn thin at the seams. Inside it was a human skull, and he never explained where it came from. They called him Jesse, maybe 15, maybe younger. Nobody knew his real age. He wandered into a town called Lantern Rock one spring, alone, barefooted, with the skull tied tight in his bag, and a way of walking that made even the toughest cowhands stop and stare. He didn't ask for food, didn't ask for work, just sat on the steps of the old mill and waited. And then strange things started happening. Disputes that had festered for years suddenly ended in handshakes. Men who'd once been violent began keeping to themselves. A man known for cheating cards in the saloon confessed one night, handed back everything he'd won, and wept into the table. No one could explain it, except that Jesse had been there, quiet in the corner, always with the bag at his feet. When someone finally asked him about the skull, he just looked up and said, "Well, it listens." Not I listen, not God listens. It listens. They never saw him open the satchel, but children swore they heard whispers when he passed by. Women said the air around him was colder. Horses avoided him. Dogs howled when he crossed the edge of town. But Jesse didn't seem afraid or cursed, just tired. One night, the mayor's brother tried to steal the bag, said it was witchcraft, said it needed to be burned. He waited until Jesse was asleep, then crept up with a knife in his belt and bad intentions in his heart. He didn't make it 2 steps. They found him at dawn, crumpled against the wall, eyes open wide in terror. No wound, no bruise, just fear carved into every muscle. And beside him, the satchel, unopened. Jesse didn't say a word, just picked it up, slung it over his shoulder, and walked out of town. No one followed. You wouldn't last a day, not because of the skull, but because you'd want to know whose it was. You'd sit beside Jesse and ask him where it came from. You'd want to hear the story, the one no one else dared to listen to. And maybe he'd tell you. Still, no one else asked. But sometimes, in the years after, people claimed to see him again, sitting quietly on a train platform, walking the edge of a canyon, always alone, always with the bag, and always in places where something unjust had happened not long before, as if he was drawn to it, or maybe as if the skull was. And in certain small towns, where old wrongs still linger in the soil, the people leave offerings on the steps of the courthouse. Small stones, coins, sprigs of sage, in case Jesse ever returns. Not to punish, not to haunt, but to listen. The doctor who prescribed death. In the Wild West, a doctor wasn't always a man with degrees or clean hands. Sometimes he was just the one with the strongest stomach, the steadiest fingers, or the cleanest knife. But in one town, a place so dry even the flies gave up, there was a man who called himself Dr. Elijah Crosby. He wore a long gray coat and carried a leather bag that smelled of iron and tobacco, and inside it were tools that gleamed like they belonged to someone who enjoyed using them. He arrived after a fever had swept through the town. Half the children sick, 3 already buried. The people were desperate. They didn't ask questions when he walked into the church-turned-hospital and said he could help, and for a while, he did. The fever stopped. The children recovered. The old ones lasted through the winter. But then people started dying without being sick, one by one. Quiet deaths, clean, no struggle, just a whisper in the lungs, a sharp ache behind the eyes, then stillness. Crosby signed every death certificate himself. Complications, he wrote, exhaustion, natural decline, The town trusted him. Who else could they trust? Until someone opened one of the bodies. It was the undertaker's apprentice, a boy named Levi, just 17, learning the trade with more curiosity than caution. One night, after a man died without warning, Levi peeked beneath the sheet. What he found made his knees buckle. 2 neat marks at the base of the neck, a dark bruise on the arm, and beneath the man's tongue, a strange blurrish black powder. Levi ran to the sheriff. The sheriff confronted the doctor, but by the time they reached the clinic, Elijah Crosby was gone, vanished. Tools missing, horse stolen. Only the coat remained, hanging from a hook by the door, and in its pocket, a slip of paper with 5 names. All crossed out, all already buried. At the bottom of the list, Levi's name. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd fall for the trick, but because you'd sense it. You'd see the 2 clean tools, the 2 quiet eyes. You'd ask why no one ever got better on their own. Why healing looks so much like silence. And they'd call you paranoid until it was too late. Still, the town remembered. They burned the clinic to the ground. Not out of rage, out of fear. The sheriff took the ashes and scattered them at the edge of town. And for years, no one called themselves a doctor there. No one hung a shingle. No one carried a black bag. Medicine became a whispered word. But sometimes, just sometimes, someone walking the high road past dusk would hear the soft creak of a saddle and see a figure in a long gray coat watching from the ridgeline, never moving, just watching, and then gone. They say he still travels, still carries the bag, still adds names to his list, the outlaw they couldn't kill. Every town had its outlaw. Some had many. But in one town, carved into a canyon where the sun vanished early and the shadows stayed long, they had one man they could never seem to bury. His name was Wade Kellum, though he answered to nothing really. A bank robber, a horse thief, a man who shot faster than his shadow and smiled with a mouthful of gold teeth and lies. They caught him once, hung him high. Sheriff tied the knot himself, pulled the lever. People cheered, and when they cut him down an hour later, Wade blinked and said, "Was that supposed to be it?" He walked out of town whistling. They caught him again, shot him clean through the chest. 5 bullets, all accounted for. They buried him on the ridge, hands crossed, eyes closed. 2 days later, the blacksmith saw him riding past on a stolen mare. They tried poison, rope, fire, buried him 3 more times in 3 different places. Each time, the grave was found empty. Each time, someone swore they saw him in the saloon by the river, leaning against the rail of the general store, with his gold teeth flashing in the moonlight. And he never aged, not a day. Some said he was cursed. Others said he made a deal with the devil, with death, with something older than both. The preacher said Wade was what happened when a man laughed at judgment too long. But even the preacher's voice started to shake when the outlaw's name was mentioned. Wade Kellum wasn't a ghost. He bled, he drank, he swore. But death? Death passed him by like a stagecoach in the fog. You wouldn't last a day. Not because he'd kill you, but because you'd ask him why he stayed. Why keep coming back to a world that spit him out? Why linger if pain never sticks and bullets never finish their story? And maybe, if you asked gently enough, he'd tell you. One man said he did, an old rancher, long dead now, who swore, and that one night Wade rode beside him in silence, then whispered, "I'm not here because I want to be. I'm here because I can't remember what comes next." Still, the town stopped chasing him. They painted over his wanted posters, burned the gallows, and when someone saw him again, sitting outside the jailhouse, flipping a coin, waiting for nothing, they just nodded and walked on. Because how do you punish a man who's already beyond it? The woman who buried her secrets in other people's graves. Not all punishments are about blood. Some are quieter, slower, the kind that stain the soul more than the skin. In a town where the earth was more graveyard than ground, where wind moved through the cemetery like it was counting the stones, there lived a woman who knew every name that had ever been buried there, not because she read the markers, but because she put half of them in the ground herself. Her name was Margaret Finch, widow, seamstress, keeper of keys to the churchyard gate. Everyone trusted her. She baked on Sundays, taught girls how to stitch and read, kept a clean home, and walked with a limp from an accident no one quite remembered. But Margaret had a habit that made some uneasy. She stayed at the graveyard long after the services ended. She was always the last to leave, and over time, folks noticed strange things. Flowers left on the wrong graves, stones rearranged, tiny objects buried at the foot of plots, a thimble, a coin, a child's shoe. Nothing obvious, nothing criminal, but something about it made people whisper. Because Margaret didn't just tend the dead, she spoke to them. Not with weeping or prayers, but in murmurs, carefully, like she was telling them things, secrets, regrets, names, and no one ever knew what they meant. Then, one spring, a young man digging a new grave struck something solid, not a coffin, a box, small, heavy, inside, letters, dozens of them, all addressed to no one, each one written in Margaret's looping hand. Confessions, sorrows, things no one had known. I watched him fall, and I didn't run. She was mine before she was yours. I said it was an accident, but I had the knife. Not all were about murder. Some were about love. Some about shame. Some about choices made when no one was watching. But all of them ended the same way. Forgive me. You'll carry this now. You wouldn't last a day, not because of the graves, but because you dig too deep. You'd want to know what each object meant, who each letter was for. You'd read the names aloud, and the silence would press heavy, not with judgment, but with the weight of shared burdens. Still, Margaret never denied it. When asked, she simply said, "The dead don't talk back. That's all." She died quietly, in her sleep. No one found her body until the afternoon, and by then the wind had already scattered her papers. But someone, no one ever knew who, buried her in the farthest corner of the cemetery, unmarked, and for the first time in years, the churchyard was still. But they say if you listen at dusk, sitting between the stones, you might hear someone whisper your name, not to accuse, but to relieve you. To say, You don't have to carry it anymore. The bride who sang at the hanging. She wore white lace to the gallows, not because it was her wedding day, but because it was the only dress she had left that still made her feel like herself. In Deadwood Hollow, hangings were public and personal. Justice wasn't just served, it was staged. Eleanor Cross was 26, too young for legend, but just the right age for tragedy. Her husband, a cattle baron, died slow with poison in his veins, and Eleanor was blamed before the ink had dried on the coroner's report. The trial was quick, her defense quiet, the jury uninterested. In towns like Deadwood, the guilty were decided before the rope was even tied. She didn't plead, she didn't beg, but when asked if she had any last request, she simply said, "Let me sing." And so, in the morning sun, as the crowd fanned themselves with paper programs and the hangman checked the knot, Eleanor sang. A hymn, soft at first, then strong, clear, like it belonged in a cathedral instead of a noose. Some said it was beautiful. Others said it was haunting. A few walked away before the last note ended, unable to bear the weight of it. When the trap door dropped, the town fell silent. No cheers, no jeers, just the wind, brushing past like it, too, had nothing left to say. They buried her in the same dress. And under the gallows, years later, someone found a note. It read, "She was innocent. We all knew it, but we wanted a show." But Deadwood wasn't the only town with secrets. The next town over had a different way of handling guilt. They kept theirs locked in a box and opened it once a year to remember. The town that put its sins in a box. Every town had ghosts, but this one gave theirs a home. It started in 1869 in the mining town of Calico Ridge. A preacher named Elias Trammell stood before his congregation with a locked iron box and a single rule: write down what you've done and seal it inside. Let the Lord do the sorting. At first, it was just confessions, stolen bread, a fist fight behind the church, a lie told to a dying man. But then came the bigger ones, the kind of sins that don't stay quiet in the dark. The box was opened only once a year, on the day of reckoning. No names, just words, written on torn scraps, whiskey labels, bits of old ledger paper. I let him hang for what I did. The well water was poisoned, buried the baby behind the chapel. The townsfolk would gather in silence as the preacher read them aloud, one by one, like prayers twisted backward. No one ever claimed them. That was the point. People said it kept the town honest. Others said it turned them all into voyeurs, addicted to guilt that didn't have a face. Children grew up hearing confessions of crimes older than their parents. And every year, someone would cry. Not because they were guilty, but because they recognized the truth and knew it still had a heartbeat. When Elias died, the tradition died with him. But the box remained, buried under the chapel floor, rusted shut, still full, and no one dares dig it up. Some say the sins inside never stopped whispering. Others say they're waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to read them all. But not all secrets stay in boxes. Some are buried with the dead, like the boy they found with a note no one could read. The boy they buried with a secret note. They found him just outside Dust Creek, lying face down in a dry riverbed with a small linen pouch clutched in his hand. No one knew his name, no missing posters, no family looking. Just a boy, barely 12, with sunburned skin, bruised knuckles, and a bullet hole so clean it looked almost surgical. But it was the note that made the undertaker go pale. Folded 4 times, tucked into the pouch, written in a cipher no one in town could read. The sheriff called in every preacher, teacher, and card cheat he could find. The letters didn't match any known code. It wasn't Latin, Greek, Cherokee, or any railroad cipher in use. Just strange looping symbols that seemed to move when you looked at them too long. The school teacher claimed the boy had written a curse in silence. The saloon girls called it devil's math. Still, they buried him. A simple grave, marked only with the words, "He came alone." The note was buried with him, against the sheriff's protest, but no one wanted to keep it. That night, 5 people in town claimed they had the same dream. The boy, standing beside his grave, mouthing words they couldn't hear but somehow understood. Years later, a linguist passed through and asked to see the note. When told it had been buried, she laughed and said, "Then I guess he took the warning with him." She didn't elaborate. She left the next morning. The grave's still there. Locals say grass won't grow on it, and sometimes at night you can hear whispering, not in English, not in any known tongue, but something older, like stone remembering what it saw. Some say the boy was a messenger. Others believe he was running from someone, like the sheriff who built a gallows for himself. The sheriff who built a gallows for himself. He was the law in name only. Sheriff Tom Gideon kept order in a town where nobody wanted it. Dirt Ridge was a speck on the edge of nowhere, a mining camp turned makeshift settlement where justice came slow, if it came at all. When Gideon arrived, he brought order with a hard stare and a faster draw. Within a year, he'd run out the card sharks, the claim jumpers, and the drunks who liked to throw dynamite for sport. But he also brought something else: lumber. Not just any lumber. Heavy timbers, oak planks, rope measured twice. And then he started building. Not a house, not a church, a gallows, on a hill just north of town. When asked why, he simply said, "It's good to be ready." People assumed he was sending a message, a warning to would-be outlaws. But months passed. No one was hanged. No one was even arrested. The gallows stood empty, a shadow across the town, creaking in the wind like a door that never shuts. Then one morning, Gideon rode up that hill, alone, left his horse, climbed the steps, and stood on the platform for over an hour, watching, thinking, maybe rehearsing. He didn't say a word to anyone. That night, he wrote 5 letters, sealed them, locked them in the sheriff's safe, and left the key with the undertaker. Next morning, he was found hanging. No note, no sign of struggle, just a full uniform and boots polished like it was a Sunday parade. When they opened the safe, the letters weren't confessions. They were apologies to men already dead. Some said he was haunted. Others believed he'd passed his own sentence for something the town never uncovered. And not everyone believed he left alone. There was a woman at his funeral, collecting echoes, the woman who collected echoes. She never gave her real name, only said she was just passing through. But every town she entered, usually quiet, forgotten places with boarded up windows and names worn off the signs, would remember her long after she'd gone. She dressed in faded black, a traveling cloak too warm for the season, and carried with her a satchel of thin glass vials. Most folks thought she was a healer. Others whispered witch. But no one could explain why she always arrived the night after someone died. She didn't ask questions. She didn't mourn. She simply walked the edge of town, found the place where someone had drawn their last breath, whether by bullet, fever, or noose, and stood there, perfectly still. Sometimes for hours, sometimes just minutes. Then she'd pull a vial from her bag, hold it to the air, and close it like she was catching a breeze. No one ever saw what she took, but people swore the air grew stiller afterward. They called her the Echo Woman, and rumors followed her like smoke. One man claimed she collected the last words of the dead. Another said she trapped guilt. A child once asked her what was in the bottles, and she answered, moments that didn't want to be forgotten. After she left, strange things happened. Rooms where the bottles had been uncorked felt colder. Dogs wouldn't go near them. One widow claimed she heard her late husband's voice whisper her name from the shelf. Another man smashed a vial in a drunken rage and collapsed minutes later, choking on invisible smoke. No one knows where she went. Some say she still walks. Some say she filled all her vials and vanished. But there was one man who tracked her, obsessed with her collection, and tried to pay for one, using something no one else had. The man who paid in dreams. He came from the east with silver buttons on his coat and a stare that looked straight through you. No one knew his name, but he signed the hotel ledger in ghost ink, letters that faded the moment you blinked. He asked about the woman in black, the one with the vials, and everyone pretended not to know what he meant, but he already knew. Said he'd followed her across 6 states, through towns that no longer existed, collecting stories no one wanted to tell. He said he wanted to buy an echo. Just one. From the night his brother died in a barn fire, no one could explain. But the Echo Woman didn't deal in coins or gold or cattle deeds. She dealt in things harder to give. Memories, secrets, things you weren't even sure were yours. He finally found her in a ghost town called Marrow's End. Population, 3 rattlesnakes, and a rocking chair that moved on its own. She was sitting on a well, her satchel beside her, waiting like she'd known he'd arrive. He offered her everything: money, land, blood from his own hand. She shook her head. "Then what do you want?" he asked. She looked up at him. "A dream, one you haven't told anyone, one that still wakes you up at night." He didn't hesitate. He whispered it into her ear, and her eyes filled with something ancient and unspeakable. She handed him a small glass vial, cool as moonlight. He opened it, just once, and for a second, he heard his brother laughing, soft, wild, alive. Then it was gone. He never spoke again. Not a word. But he smiled, they said, every night, just before sleep, like someone who had been forgiven by something older than time. And if you're quiet, truly quiet, you might still hear them all: the bride, the boy, the sheriff, the Echo Woman, the dreamer, haunting the wind in towns long buried, reminding us, in the Wild West, not all stories end when the dust settles. The hangman who couldn't sleep. In a town where the gallows never stayed empty for long, there lived a man who knew the weight of necks better than most men know the weight of their own sins. He was the hangman, not by choice, he always said, not by desire, but because someone had to do it. And he was the only one whose hands didn't tremble when it was time. They called him Finch, just Finch. No one knew if that was his first name or his last, and no one dared ask. He lived in a house behind the jailhouse, alone, with shutters that never opened and a bed that stayed cold. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't visit the brothel or the church. His only company was a rope, thick, braided, oiled smooth, coiled neatly on a hook above his fireplace. He cleaned it after every job, replaced it when it frayed, kept a tally in a little book. 67 hangings in 17 years. Some were guilty, some weren't. Finch never asked. That wasn't his job. He never looked at the prisoners when they climbed the steps, only at their feet, at the trap door, at the knot. But at night, when the town went still, Finch didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, wide-eyed, the rope still visible in the corner of his eye, like it might whisper to him if he dared to blink. He kept candles burning long after midnight, the wax dripping into slow, silent pools. And sometimes, though no one but Finch knew this, he heard voices in the floorboards. Not angry voices, not vengeful, just remembering. He knew them all by name. Eloise, who'd stolen to feed her baby. Carver, who killed in a duel but was too poor to afford a lawyer. Jonas, who had confessed to a crime he didn't commit just to protect someone else. They spoke to him not to haunt, but to remind. And Finch, steady Finch, wrote down their names in another book. Not the tally of numbers, but a book bound in soft leather, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. In it, he wrote their full names, their stories, their last words, if they gave any, if they wept, if they smiled, if they simply breathed in one last time and let go. You wouldn't last a day, not because you couldn't do his job, but because you'd care. You'd look into their eyes. You'd wonder who they loved. You'd wake in the night thinking about how the wind moved through the empty noose. You'd ask, how many times can a man do this before he becomes the rope himself? Still, Finch never quit. When the townsfolk asked him why, he only said, I make sure they don't go alone. And when Finch died, quietly, sitting upright in his chair, hands folded over that little leather book, they found no family to claim the body, but someone, perhaps the sheriff, perhaps the preacher, buried him at the edge of the graveyard. No stone, just a short post with a single word carved into it, witness. And they burned the rope, the jury that never left the room. It was supposed to be a simple case. A stolen mule, a broken fence, a man named Hutchins accusing another named Beale, and the whole thing as dry and uneventful as the dust that settled on the windowsills of the courthouse. The kind of trial that ended with a handshake, a fine, maybe a little shame, and a promise to do better. But in the town of Sallow Creek, justice had a habit of slipping sideways. And that day, something didn't feel right. The sky was too still. The heat sat heavy. And when the 12 jurors were led into the back room to deliberate, they never came out. They locked the door behind them. At first, the sheriff knocked politely, then louder, then with his boot. But no answer came. Just silence. Dry and deep, like the room had swallowed their voices whole. Some said they were praying. Others said they were arguing. But after 6 hours, the sheriff broke down the door. The room was empty. No chairs moved. No water poured. No signs of struggle. Just 12 coats hanging neatly on the wall. 12 pairs of boots lined by the door. And 12 name tags left on the table like the verdict had already been delivered. And it was them. Gone. You wouldn't last a day. Not because you'd disappear, but because you'd open the door anyway. You'd look into the room everyone avoids. You'd sit in the chair still warm with absence. And you'd ask, what kind of justice makes the jury vanish? Still, people tried to explain it. One man claimed the jurors had staged it, a trick to avoid judgment. Another said it was the curse of the courthouse, built on land that was never truly quiet. A few believed the jury had been taken, not by force, but by truth, that whatever they saw, whatever they knew, it was enough to unmake them. After that, trials were never held in Sallow Creek again. The courthouse was boarded up. Birds nested in the eaves. The clock tower stopped ticking. And yet, sometimes, people swore they saw shadows behind the second-floor window. 12 of them, silent, still, waiting. No one ever reopened that room. No one ever held another jury. But one year, exactly to the day, someone left a note tacked to the courthouse door. In 12 identical handwritings, it read, "Guilty, all of us. Sleep now. The door is closed. The jury has gone. The room is dark, but it does not want you. You are not a witness. You are not an accused. You are not asked to choose. Let the courthouse rot in the sun. Let the verdict drift like smoke. You are not part of that story. Not this time. Let your thoughts be light. Let your conscience be quiet. Let your name stay outside the ledger. Close your eyes. No judgment tonight. No deliberation. Only stillness. And if, in your dreams, 12 chairs sit in a circle, empty, waiting, walk past them. You owe them nothing. You are free. You are resting, and you are not on trial anymore.